Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in our beautiful Canadian landscape. Matthew Chapman here from Climate Reality Canada, and very, very pleased to be having Mr. Allan DSouza with us this evening, Mayor of St-Laurent, borough of Montreal, approximately 100,000 citizens and over 100,000 jobs. The Community Climate Hub Fall Webinar Series is underway, well underway. And you'll see here on the screen that today's webinar with Mr. DSouza is one of many in the coming weeks before we take a break for the holiday season. My name is Matthew Chapman, as I mentioned, campaign coordinator for Climate Reality Project Canada. And through several trainings each year, just a bit about climate reality, we train, Al Gore in fact trains leaders from across the world. We now have over 15,000 folks who've taken personal trainings from Al Gore about how to communicate the urgency and solutions to climate change to help increase political will and ambition to act on this important issue. We're also helping create community climate hubs. Oh, sorry, I should mention that this is the Canadian delegation to Pittsburgh a couple of weeks ago. So we had a good time down there. We're also in the process of creating community climate hubs that are basically citizen groups across the country that help motivate their communities and build solutions to act on climate change while improving their quality of life. This webinar, so today's webinar, of course, features Allan DSouza, as I mentioned, and Allan is an accountant by trade. Mayor DSouza has followed international climate negotiations closely since taking office in 1990 and attended the World Summit on Sustainable Development in Johannesburg in 2002. He was elected mayor of St-Laurent in 2001 and has since been re-elected to 5 consecutive terms. In collaboration with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, he has made St-Laurent the first sub-municipal jurisdiction in the country to release its own greenhouse gas reduction plan. And this summer released a suite of 5 complementary plans for the borough. The greenhouse gas plan itself, the reduction plan, a transportation plan, a social development plan, a sustainable development plan, and finally a cultural development plan. I've had the pleasure of watching mountains move under his direction. He has done some incredible things in Montreal and can say with confidence that if all municipalities were to devote the kind of time and resources to the sustainable development that Mr. DSouza has, that we would have a country well on its way to meeting and surpassing our Paris targets. With that, I give you Mr. Allan DSouza.
Hi, good afternoon or good evening, everyone. Allan DSouza, Mayor of St-Laurent here, and a pleasure to be here with you. I want to thank Matthew for those generous words, and at the same time welcome you to this webinar and hope it will be something that meets your expectations. My objective today would be to give you a bit of a background of the community that I'm serving, and then walk right into what we've done in recent times, so that in a space of about 15 minutes, 17 odd minutes, give you the gist of what we've done, open it up to questions. I'd be more than happy to provide any answers that I could to help you. As Mayor of St-Laurent, I have lived in the community and am part of a community that has over 174 different ethnicities. It's one of the most diverse communities in Canada and most definitely in Quebec. At the same time as we have a population of 103,000 people, we also have over 5,000 industries in aeronautics, in life sciences, in information technology, and soon to be clean tech as well. 5,000 companies, 107,000 jobs. So it's a good community that that you can gauge as being involved in both from citizens who are involved and are active, but also in terms of companies who contribute to our economy and who contribute to the well-being of our community. Now, we've been involved in St-Laurent over many years. I've had the privilege of sitting on the Montreal Executive Committee for 11 years to bring forth several initiatives that the City of Montreal has taken a leadership position on. In part on sustainable development, on the protection of greenhouse gases, on waste management and composting, on green buildings, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, as we were as I've tried to position Montreal as a green community, and we've done some amazing things, I've also felt the need and obligation to make sure that my community, where I live and where I'm mayor, can also provide the same type of leadership. So I have had the ability to use my community as a kind of laboratory where we can do really exciting stuff on sustainable development and on greenhouse gases in the environment, using it as an opportunity to test certain items and then even to go further. With that in mind, I've been involved in several climate change conferences, both on climate change, sustainable development, biodiversity, and so on and so forth. The one common theme that seems to emanate out of all of these conferences have been nice plan, no implementation. Year after year, cities come by with beautiful plans showing dogs and birds and bees and a whole bunch of other nice stuff with little kids, but in reality, not much has changed. And that's why when I've been active on this file, I wanted to make sure that we can do something that is concrete, tangible, real action on the ground that can show tangible results, measurable results. So that's why we have worked very hard in my community to make sure that we can do so. We have a record of doing that over the last 15 years. And this year we decided to put in place several plans that dovetail with what we are trying to do in Montreal and in the greater Montreal region, but specific plans that are measurable at the local level. So, for example, this past August, my council and myself, with work that we were doing, developed 5 plans. These plans touched upon sustainable development, touched upon greenhouse gas reduction, transportation, culture, social development, and as well touched upon economic development, which was developed earlier. We built these plans with the interest, the contribution, the acquiescence, the involvement of our community. For over a year and a half prior to the adoption of these plans, we met with people, not just in meetings where we invited them to come by and meet with us. We also went further in that, and we wanted to make sure that we could reach out to the community, whether they were in the parks, the swimming pools, our buildings, the schools, wherever we found people, we reached out. We used social media, we used internet, we used interactive mechanisms. We had standard meetings as well where people would be invited to come in and participate. And out of all of that, we were able to glean what was interesting, what was wished for by the community. That type of effort meant that we had to cast our net very wide to get as many of the best ideas that could be brought forth, but also to understand what the value systems of our community are and where they wanted us to go. That information was distilled and worked on with other partners. Our other partners include community groups, environmental groups, governmental groups, business communities, and so on. And the objective in this was to take the raw material that we got from our residents, but to be able to put it into a framework that it could be useful and could provide us with an agenda for the next 5 years. Out of that came the plans. So our first plan is on sustainable development. It's one that dovetails with the City of Montreal and has specific targets with regard to greenhouse gas reductions, with regard to waste management, with regard to water consumption, biodiversity, the economy, and so on and so forth. And that sustainable development plan basically set out concrete actions to achieve those objectives and the ability to measure those objectives with specific deadlines. Now, often you don't see those type of accountability mechanisms built into the plan. I wanted to make sure that those accountability mechanisms were there so that we'd be able to assess our progress and evaluate what worked and what didn't work with a view to being better. Out of the Sustainable Development Plan came the plan for the reduction of greenhouse gases. In this case, we adhered to the climate protection plan with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. It meant that we had to do an inventory both for what the city generated, but as well as inventory of what the greater community generated in terms of greenhouse gases per person. And that being done, it took us an effort to do that, to do it at our level, to be able to quantify what was our generation and our contribution to greenhouse gases, but to be able to set up targets that we felt were achievable over the next mandate, targets that we would be able to actually achieve through strategies. And so in each and one of the plans, we had one plan built for our for the city, so that in our operations, whether it be buildings, whether it be fleet management, lighting, waste management, we had specific strategies that we were putting in place to be able to move the ball. At the same time, we were able to also put in place a series of objectives and strategies for the broader community, for the people who live in our community, for the business to do that. Again, reaching out to the residential, the non-residential communities, to make institutional communities, to make sure that that same type of strategies and objectives were put in place with deadlines and with objectives to achieve. So that represents what we were doing on greenhouse gas reductions. We had the series of other plans were also adopted, one on transportation, because transport is a critical element in our community, both for economic competitivity, but also to be able to reduce greenhouse gases. It's the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases over there in our territory, and so we wanted to make sure that this was put in place. And following that, we also put in place the versions with regard to our culture and with regard to social development. Culture is in there as the fourth leg of a stool. Traditionally, sustainable development is known to have the economy, the environment, and social development as the three legs of a stool. But we felt, and we were the first community to identify culture as being a important fourth leg of the stool. And in that respect, we developed measures on culture, both within our internal corporate culture, but also in broader culture in the community, to make sure that this type of measure is not ignored. These plans were not done in isolation. Traditionally, cities, as you may know, work in silos. They work by themselves in segregation. We worked hard to break down the silos. We tried to make sure that we got the input from people around our community, but at the same time, the different municipal services worked in an interdisciplinary fashion to be able to actually work together. So it would not be any surprise at all to find people in urban planning working together with economic development, to find out people in public works working together with our culture, recreation, and sports departments. We worked hard to make sure that all of our employees were not only adherent to our philosophies and our values, but they worked together in concrete terms to make sure that all of these plans were developed on an integrated, on an interdisciplinary basis, so that they were not something that just one group of employees were doing. The result of these efforts have not been not only to have plans that are integrated and are elaborated within the frameworks, but it also helped us to change the culture of our community, change the culture of our city, make sure that all of our employees understand where we're going, why we're going there, and in making them involved and getting them involved in the process has been in part one of the reasons why we have these plans. So clearly these things didn't happen by itself. Our employees were a big part of, to help us get to where we want to today. That being said, I don't think we can rest on our laurels. These plans are there and are available for people to actually implement. We have just received a new mandate from the population. We have another 4 years in our term now as of last Sunday. And our intent is to now take these plans, which were adopted by council, and integrate these into our budgetary framework. We have a budget to pass from here to the end of the year. We are now in the process of prioritizing many of the action items that are there. These will be realized over the next 4 years. They can't be all realized in 1 year. So we are prioritizing them and making sure that there is money attached to each of these plans so that we can make it happen. By doing so, we're not just coming up with a plan, but we've got making sure that we have the monetary resources, the human resources, and the time resources to be able to allocate such that these plans would then be able to see the light of day. And that's how we're intending to move forward to make sure that these happen. So I wanted to give you a broad brushstroke of how things are. what we have done and what we hope to do. I hope now to be able to then take questions from you and be able to answer any of the queries you may have.
Thank you very much, Allan, for that terrific overview of what St-Laurent has been able to do, especially in these last few months leading up to the elections. And congratulations on your re-election by a large majority in St-Laurent. Just before we jump into questions, and I encourage everyone to use the question and answer feature at the bottom of their screens to pose questions that I'm sure they will have. A number of questions already came in on the registration form, so I'll be happy to address those shortly as well. But in the meantime, just for a moment, I will jump into a brief presentation on what the Climate Hub campaign is about, so that those who may not be familiar will have a bit of an idea of what we're proposing to folks across the country. In the cities that are named on the screen, between now and the end of the year, there will be a group ready to accept new members, basically an active hub whose objective it is to push their cities along the FCM, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, 5-step milestone framework. And this is a framework that Mr. DSouza is very, very familiar with, because him and his team have worked tirelessly to push St-Laurent along this framework. So first issue being creating a GHG emissions inventory, certainly setting a target to reduce that GHG amount that the inventory revealed, developing a local action plan, which is what St-Laurent has just published, a number of action plans that are complementary, that are not isolated, that are not developed in silos, but are synergistic and that serve each other. Implementing the local plan, evidently, and that's where Mr. DSouza is mentioning with respect to finding the budgetary kind of where within the budget can we make room for the expenses that are going to be incurred to implement these plans. And finally, monitoring progress and results. So just these groups across the country have for their purpose to push their city along that. And they have three main criteria. They are local focused. They're citizens who believe that acting locally is the best and most efficient and effective way of making change. And while building community, while building friendships, while reaching into diverse communities. So it is citizen driven as well. We cannot wait for the Climate Reality Project to do the work. We have a very limited number of staff. We cannot wait for governments to step in and push things through, because quite realistically, they follow citizens. Citizens are the drivers, and the citizens need to make their voices heard and make their demands clear. And that helps political decision makers move forward more ambitiously. So, and then of course, diversity is a key piece of the puzzle. What Climate Reality and support organizations, including I Matter Youth and including the Sierra Club Quebec, but the doors are wide open to include other organizations who are willing to support these hubs across the country. What we're doing on our website, climatehub.ca, is producing these tools that hubs can use to effectively engage their communities in discussion, effectively engage their politicians in debate and say, what can we do? How can we move forward more quickly? One of the questions posed in the registration form was around the issue of benchmarking. How do we benchmark cultural, progress? How do we know that within the boundaries of our municipality that culture is changing, or a more sustainable culture is taking root? So that's something that I think we could debate quite long about, but it'd be interesting to hear Mr. DSouza's take on that momentarily. The Climate Hub initiative seeks to benchmark the following criteria: governance, eco-fiscal measures, urban planning, transportation progress, the energy mix of cities, building bylaws, and waste management. And the first report will be published in April of 2018. So we have a group in Ottawa right now piloting this project. And then we will be with the 20 municipalities that are currently on board or will be on board by the end of this year. We will be beginning to benchmark those municipalities on these criteria starting in January, with the objective to have a preliminary or a kind of a test run report published in April of 2018, prior to moving to an even larger number of cities in 2018, and for publication of a first full report in 2019. So, and just an aside, the year of the Earth, Earth Day was founded almost 25 years. No, sorry, it will be. I think it will be the 50-year anniversary of Earth Day. Is that possible? The Earth year is 2020. I'm not sure what if it's the 30th anniversary or the 40th anniversary of Earth Day, but we hope to have a really solid network of hubs ready to report on their municipalities' progress by the time Earth Year, pardon me, rolls around. So with that said, we have a couple of questions that have come in since I started my little spiel, and we have also a couple from the registration form. So please do not hesitate to add your questions to the Q&A, or if you would like to in the chat as well. So question from Tracy, and I should also mention that we have people on the webinar today. I saw on the sign-up sheet from Miami Beach, Florida, all the way to Vancouver, all the way to throughout Quebec and Ontario and Winnipeg. So welcome everybody. With Allan DSouza leading the way, Tracy asks, can we see their work already put together as a fabulous resource? Okay, so how can citizens in other jurisdictions, other municipalities, use the resources that St-Laurent, or inspire themselves by some of the resources that St-Laurent has developed? Would you like to speak to that, Allan?
Sure. These plans are available in French, and subject to availability of funding, we hope to also see what that could be done to make them available in English as well. They're available online at our website. If you go to the City of Montreal's website and click St-Laurent, you just have to go down to what's called local plans, and on the local plans, each of these plans, whether it be sustainable development, greenhouse gas reductions, transportation, social development, and culture, are all available. So it's pretty easy to access, and let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's see what's out there, and if you like what some of the stuff we've done, take it and develop it in your community. At the same time, let's get real on another front. We did this with a full knowledge of what's in our community. You're clearly going to have to do that same type of analysis, that same type of reach out to your people who live in your community, and tailor the right strategies for them depending on what objectives you set. So whereas we can be part of the answer, there's definitely going to be some work that's going to have to be done on your part. It would be too easy to cut and paste.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to mention the public engagement part. That's what builds kind of support to implement the plans too. It's all well and good to develop a beautiful plan, but unless you've got people on board, unless you've consulted with a wide variety of stakeholders, then it's going to be more difficult to get those plans implemented. Thanks so much, Tracy, for the question. George asks, what were the main difficulties in getting the public on board with GHG reduction plans and other plans? Has there been any pushback?
Well, I guess the biggest thing is that people are in favor of these type of initiatives in theory, but the challenge comes when you have to ask them to change and make changes in their own life and their own lifestyle. At that point, some people feel that it's government intervening. Some people feel that there should be other ways to do it. Some people feel that you should go after other emitters who should be targeted first. So you do have that syndrome. And I can use that in an example as what we tried on composting. Everyone wanted to reduce greenhouse gases. Very few people realize that greenhouse gases come when you send a lot of your organic materials to landfill. So when we introduced the composting program in our community and we spread it across the entire community, cut back garbage pickup to make sure that people would compost, we did have some concerns expressed. People felt their services were reduced. We had to do a lot of explaining to people to tell them what the strategy was, why we were doing it, what was the reason, and how it was not a service cut, but rather it was an effort to increase composting, reduce greenhouse gases, and ultimately save them taxes. And they finally got that when they understood they were saving money and they were would reduce their taxes. They understood very quickly. So those are the type of examples where we have had pushback. But I think it takes a lot of education to let people know, particularly when it's happening in their own on their own community, in their own homes, in their own backyards, in their own kitchens. That's where the explanations have to come and have to come fast.
Okay, thanks so much, Allan, and great question, George. A couple of other questions that came in on the registration form. One around social benchmarking. How do you decide that a social, a development plan has worked? How do you decide if it has in fact contributed to the improvement or the reduction in unsustainable behaviors, of your? Has that been looked at? Do you expect to benchmark it? Do you expect to be measuring? What are the outcomes that you think will be able to indicate?
Well, I guess in social development, we want to make sure that as a community, we are not just focusing on creating the wealth, but also making sure that no part of our community is being left behind. So we want to make sure that there's equity in terms of the services we offer. We want to make sure that families who are perhaps new to the community, who might be in poverty, can have the same chances as everyone else. We want to promote a healthy living lifestyle, an active lifestyle. We want to favor urban agriculture, which gets people in touch with the land. So those are some of the issues that we're grappling with as we develop, measure, and build the social component to it. For an example, we were probably one of the first somewhere in 2007 where we changed our food policies such that in our local arena, we only offered healthy meals, i.e. wraps, salads, fruits, juices, and so on and so forth. We definitely had pushback. We were cited in the Globe and Mail that went across the country telling how we were changing Canadian values. It seems like the rink burger or poutine was a national culinary treasure that had to be preserved, and we were taken to task on getting rid of this. But when we explained to people that we were trying to build healthy athletes, our kids had to eat right to be able to perform well, that protest didn't last long. And I'm pleased to say that we were the first in Montreal to lead that charge. Today, more people are getting on board, but it's just a small example of how you can make sure you build healthy communities. How do we measure it? I think we look closely to what are the projects that we've put in place and how do we actually realize the projects. We see who we reach out to. We work with the community groups to make sure that these projects are there. And they're probably not only our best ambassadors, but also our harshest critics from time to time, letting us know when we do well, but also letting us know when we could do better.
Terrific. Thanks so much. That touches in part on a question from Ray in Toronto. The title of Culture is Positive, the idea that we want to kind of manufacture culture, or there's that big brother, as you mentioned, we don't want to appear as though the government is intervening, but you also have to take into consideration, or we need to be better at educating people about the real costs of their decisions. So a classic example is that of cigarettes. Cigarettes cost the healthcare system millions, if not billions of dollars, and therefore right up front, people should be paying more for the product that causes the harm. This is something that is also, as I mentioned to Allan prior to the webinar, the rationale of a lawsuit that is being brought against certain oil companies by municipalities. And I don't remember what jurisdiction. They're trying to do something similar in BC now, but I believe there's another jurisdiction in the world where they're already holding fossil fuel companies to account for the climate damages that the municipalities themselves are incurring. So I've got to build a retaining wall. I've got to build, additional dikes, for example, to guard against sea level rise in places like Miami. And what percentage of that climate change that resulted in that sea level rise is attributable to, ExxonMobil or another major oil company? And it, in fact, is a material sum of money. So very interesting. So with that said, pardon me, Ray's question, what would you recommend? How would you recommend that we impact, or how could aside from the example of food in arenas, are there other eco-fiscal measures, other ways that we can incorporate some of those costs of climate change into the behaviors that are causing climate change at the municipal level?
Well, let me start off by talking about culture in the context of municipal employee culture. I think one of the biggest things is our employees are our biggest resource, and by being able to bring them into the loop and help them understand what we are trying to achieve is a huge cultural shift, a huge paradigm shift in terms of being able to get our employees to go in the direction that we want. That being said, our community is a very diverse community. We've got over 50% of our population who are visible minorities. Over 80% of our population was born outside Canada. Over 174 different ethnicities. Some who speak English, some who speak French, but some who don't speak either language. So clearly, we have challenges to be able to reach out to the community and to make sure that they understand what we're trying to do. It's very, very important to make sure that we can reach out to these communities and let them know. We've had and begun and are still doing sessions in which we explain to people what climate change is all about, how they can change their own behavior. And by doing so, they become ambassadors to the community. We fund youth groups who are able to actually, over a period of time, learn the environmental concepts and again, go to their schools. We find that children in the schools are great ambassadors. And so by being able to teach the adolescents, the teenagers what to do, they go out there and disseminate that information within their peer groups. And that is a big, big help. So that is the type of effort that we deploy to make sure that people in the community understand. That being said, we do have other means, such as you talked about eco-fiscality. Yep, that is something that we do where I'm a big proponent of user pay, particularly in terms of water usage or in terms of garbage generation. And so, yes, when we meter water to make sure that the precious resource is used well, but at the same time, no one is deprived of access and use to water. It's a responsible way of managing a precious resource. And in a similar manner, on waste management, we have the same type of philosophy. So there's a variety of tax measures that are available to us and that we can use. There's also other means in which we can make sure that that message goes through.
Terrific. Another question that's really key to today's webinar. How does the cultural plan, if you can get a little more granular, how does it dovetail with and enable the other plans?
Well, I've said that we believe that in addition to the three other pillars of social development, economic development, and environment, that culture is the fourth leg on the stool. The culture reaches out to the community and makes sure that the human dimension is not forgotten. It's clear that if you're dealing with the economy, you can reach out and just work on what business wants. But the human dimension comes through in culture. And by being able to provide forums where we can bring people into and develop a common civic culture, a common understanding of what the objectives are, using the arts, using sports, using recreation as ways to forge a culture that everyone understands, makes it so much easier. If people tend to be closed off into their own communities or their own culture and their own ethnic communities, then clearly that's a hard way for a city to get the information out. And I try to break down the walls. We work a lot with youth as well in culture to make sure that we can reach out to them in the arts and through music, through theater, through other venues, through mediation, in a cultural mediation in our community to reach out to the youth and the not so young as well. So these are ways to break down the walls and to make sure that people understand they bring what they have to the table, but at the same time, they get to know what our broad cultural orientations are, what our civic values are. We also work beyond culture to create a community where equity is important, where people have access to services, regardless of where they come from, that we eliminate discrimination and make sure that people have access to jobs. And these are important concepts into making sure that the social and the cultural component is not forgotten. So there are a variety of measures that we use, but all of them work together seamlessly to be able to reach out to the community and get that message out.
Great. Thank you so much, Allan. One quick final question before we conclude, and that being a question from Maya in Mississauga. When a community is shifting so quickly, when you've got a rapid influx of immigrants and you're going from maybe a homogenous community to a very heterogeneous community over the course of 5 years or 10 years, how do you make sure that a cultural plan is adaptable and flexible enough to address those rapid changes. I mean, we're seeing a big influx, you know, as the doors to immigration are flung open to people from all over the world that are seeking refuge.
Well, thank you, Maya, for that question. I think it's a very pertinent question. I don't think at this point any community in Canada has not seen a change in its demographic mix. I don't think any community has not seen new immigrants come to the community and have not had to take steps to make sure that they integrate well into the community. At the same time, it's important to recognize what are appropriate civic values and to find ways and means and forums in which these newcomers can interface, can interact with longtime residents so that you don't have the frictions, you don't have the cultural irritations that come about when people come together. I've often advocated the fact that people, when they come to this country and when they come to our communities, leave their baggage behind. Having 174 different ethnicities in my community, you can well imagine that if different communities are fighting in their own parts of the world and they import those fights or those conflicts to Canada, to St-Laurent for that matter, we would be just continuing on the fight. And I often tell them to check that those prejudices, those fights, those disputes at customs, so that they leave it at the airport when they come to our community. We work also very hard with the youth, because clearly if we're going to make changes in terms of integration and making sure that you're bringing people into a community where you have a respect for their culture, but they must also have a respect for the broad culture to the place where they're coming to, that they understand what that is. So with the kids, we work a lot to make sure they understand. They often are first, second generations, and they learn hard. And I think we try hard to break down the walls. We try to make sure that people don't stay closed off into their communities, even if they are new to the country. Perhaps it's normal and natural for people to be in institutions with their own cultural institutions, their own language, but we work hard to break down those walls to make sure that they integrate well. And those are some of the strategies that we use to make sure that even in the context of new influxes of immigrants, that those immigrants ease into the community and we don't hit walls. I can tell you that I've never had to read the papers to find out what is the latest crisis in the world. In my community in St-Laurent, wave after wave of people have come over the last 40 years. And I need to go down to the local grocery store to know which is the most recent wave of people who have come by. It could be natural catastrophes, could be political crises, could be all sorts of reasons why people leave their countries. But when they come here, we try to make sure that they leave the negative aspects behind and they come here on a positive note with a view to contributing to our country and to our community.
Terrific. And I think it's absolutely essential that we don't forget that when we want everybody to jump on the bandwagon of, you know, sustainable development, we have to realize that they've got mouths to feed. You know, we've really created a system, or we've got on our hands a problem that that there's a lot of people living hand to mouth, you know, and paycheck to paycheck, and particularly those new to the country. So really important and really.
Well, I'd like to jump in here and say that social harmony is so important. We might work very hard in our communities for economic success, but we will never be able to do that if you don't have social harmony. And I remember once at one of the international conferences, I was with Ken Livingston, Mayor of London, and Bertrand Delanoë, who was the Mayor of Paris. And we were talking about the potential for mutual exchanges between our cities. And both mayors of London and Paris came to me and said, look, Allan, we'd be quite happy to work with you guys and send out delegations and see how we can work together. But what is your secret of social success? How come in Montreal, how come in St-Laurent, you're able to live so well together? In our own cities, we have continual strife that really is an impediment to our economic success. So whereas I was interested in economic exchanges, I could see that these two mayors of large cities were seeking the solution for social success as a prerequisite for economic success. And it's a lesson that I never forgot. So I think that's something we need to work on to make sure that those building blocks of social harmony and social success are in place that would allow us then to build economic successful communities.
Terrific. Thank you very much for that insight, Allan. And just to conclude with Tracy's comment, it is in fact the 50th anniversary in 2020. So I didn't quite have my numbers lined up, but Earth Day did start in 1970, and of course happens every April 22nd. And it will be the 50th anniversary of Earth Day in 2020, and that makes it Earth Year. And you'll start hearing about that soon if you haven't already started. All right. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us, and for Allan especially. If you'd like to attend our next English webinar, it will be on Wednesday of next week, and it will feature Kara Clareman, pardon me, of Plug and Drive, a startup in the Toronto area, and Jeff Turner of Dunsky Consulting, a transportation expert out of Vancouver, discussing the opportunities and challenges of electric vehicle implementation and uptake. So you can sign up, of course, for that on the same site if you haven't already, climatehub.ca. Thanks so much, and we'll see you again next week.
Thanks very much.